Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ware Harmon, and I'm the Executive Director of Town Hall Seattle. On behalf of our organization and our partners today at Common Justice and the Elliott Bay Book Company, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's virtual presentation of Danielle Sered in conversation with Nikkita Oliver as part of our Civics series. As we get underway, I want to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continued use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. And we thank you all for joining us here on our new streaming platform, My Town Hall Seattle. Like everything at Town Hall, it's decidedly a work in progress. So if you have any questions or concerns about your experience, please use the Patron Services email you will see below in the chat. This afternoon's conversation will run around 60 minutes, including the Q&A. Questions will be selected from those in the chat field below the video player. You may have to scroll down to see it. Please feel free to add yours at any time. We can't guarantee we'll be able to address every question, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. And toward that end, keep your questions concise and in the form of a question, please. For those who'd like to view the program with closed captions, click the CC button at the bottom right corner of the video player. Town Hall is adding new programs every day. Upcoming events include an introduction to our new artist in residence, Timothy White Eagle, exploring Native American, pagan, and other earth-based spiritual practices over a 3-month residency with us. Alyssa Washuta, Teresa Warburton, and Kristen Millarez Young, discussing the extraordinary breadth of literature by Native women. And City Club's latest edition of Civic Cocktail, featuring a frank discussion of efforts to restore the vitality of downtown Seattle, featuring Ivor's president, Bob Donegan, and Brian Surratt, former director of the City of Seattle's Office of Economic Development. Other upcoming events include Renee Plank with her story of a family life hijacked by a mother's entry into a cult, legendary songwriter and guitarist Richard Thompson with a soon-to-be-announced conversation partner of some acclaim, war correspondent Sebastian Junger, 3 more installments in our annual Engage series of dispatches on the latest research from UW Laboratories, and finally 3 more installments of our ongoing Earshot Jazz live programs, each with opportunities for live in-building attendance. So keep your eyes peeled for those and for other exciting opportunities on our online calendar at townhallseattle.org. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our members and sponsors. Our Civic series is supported by the Real Networks Foundation, the True Brown Foundation, KUOW, the Norcliffe Foundation, and the Wyncote Foundation Northwest. But as most of you know, Town Hall is at heart a member-supported organization, and I want to thank all of our members watching today. One last piece of infomercial, I promise. You're here today because you care about the issues around mass incarceration. You'll almost certainly want to go deeper into the work discussed in Danielle's book. So if you'll consider purchasing your copy this afternoon here for our partners at Elliott Bay, instead of later on from some other online retailer that you know might sell lots of other things too. Town Hall asks you to consider keeping it local, and just maybe the things we love about our city from before the pandemic will still be here for us on the other side. And with all of that, Danielle Sered has devoted much of her career to designing and directing programs that teach conflict resolution through the arts in schools and juvenile detention centers. Through extensive involvement in gang intervention work, she has developed and implemented violence intervention and trauma-informed care practices and curricula, and has garnered experience in restorative justice and conflict resolution techniques. She's the founder and director of Common Justice, a nonprofit that develops and advances practical, groundbreaking solutions to violence that advance racial equity, meet the needs of those harmed, and do not rely on incarceration. Before planning the launch of Common Justice, Sered served as the deputy director of the Vera Institute of Justice's Adolescent Reentry Initiative, a program for young men returning from incarceration on Rikers Island. Her writing includes The Other Side of Harm, addressing disparities in our responses to violence, and Accounting for Violence, How to Increase Safety and Break Our Failed Reliance on Mass Incarceration. Nikkita Oliver is a Seattle-based community organizer, abolitionist, educator, and attorney. They are the executive director of Creative Justice, an arts-based alternative to incarceration and a healing engaged, youth-led, community-based program. Oliver organizes through No New Youth Jail, Decriminalize Seattle, COVID-19 Mutual Aid Seattle, and the Seattle People's Party. They have been featured on The Breakfast Club, KUOW's The Week in Review, and The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, and their work has been seen on the South Seattle Emerald, Crosscut, The Establishment, and more. Nikkita ran for mayor of Seattle in 2017 as the first political candidate of the Seattle People's Party. Danielle Sered's latest book, Until We Reckon, Violence, Mass Incarceration, and a Road to Repair, is the subject of their discussion today. Thanks for staying indoors with us on such a glorious day in Seattle or wherever you are. And please join me in welcoming Nikkita Oliver and Danielle Sered.
Well, good afternoon. Peace, Seattle. We have finally made it to the sunnier days in the Pacific Northwest. So thank you again for joining us. Let me turn this video on. Oh, would the host mind turning my video on for me? I'd greatly appreciate it. Awesome. And for rocking with us through all this technology we've all been learning throughout the time of COVID. I am super excited to share digital space with Danielle Sered and honored that you would join us for this conversation. I love learning from some of the OGs in this work and growing in our understanding of how we can build a world beyond prisons and police. So Danielle, thank you so much for sharing space with us today, for sharing your knowledge and the things that you've learned. I think people often believe that we are born knowing what to do, or we're born abolitionists, or we're born activists and organizers. And it really is something that we evolve into. I don't think people here in the Pacific Northwest realize that, like I was born in Indianapolis, Indiana. And I would say that up until probably about 10, 12 years ago, I thought that there was probably a place in society for prisons and police. And it was being in the trenches with young people and families. It was seeing firsthand the things that communities have been struggling through, understanding that often those who have caused harm are also those who have experienced harm, and asking myself, is there a better way to keep communities safe? And so I was wondering if you could first just open up by sharing with us how you came to this work. What are the ways in which maybe your understandings or your beliefs have shifted over time, and why do you think those shifts occurred?
So thank you so much, Nikkita. Thank you, Seattle Town Hall and beautiful people of Seattle, for having me with you today. We were supposed to be together right at the very beginning of COVID, and so feel really grateful we found our way back around through this new means. And I appreciate your question, because I think the less theoretical our understanding of prison is, usually the more critical we are. And so I think for many of us, we evolve into our criticism of it as we get more information through our own lived experience, instead of through whatever we're being taught in other ways. And for me, that happens most centrally growing up in Chicago. I came of age in the late 80s and early 90s, at the height of what we called the crack epidemic, and what we now understand was the moment in our history when mass incarceration was beginning to really get its stride. It's when we were departing from our status as a country that incarcerated about as many people as many other countries, to become the nation who incarcerates the most people ever in all of human history. And that was starting to unfold in neighborhoods I lived in Chicago. I watched people go away to prison and come back worse for it. They came back worse for it because, as I've come to understand, I think prison is designed to sort of attack in me the thing that suffers when you feel pain. I don't know if we had a design challenge to think of a better way to do that, a better way to bring an assault on our core functions of empathy, that anyone could design something better than prison for it. Some people come through even that with their whole heart and spirit intact. Those people are extraordinary. And I'm humble enough to know I might not be one of them, especially in the face of that really intense harm. So people came back worse for it. So it was clear to me that it wasn't actually to make people better, that story wasn't true. And so I paid attention to the story that prison was being done for survivors, that it was there to keep safe and to avenge the people who were hurt. But I started paying attention then to my own experience as a survivor. I've survived rape. I've lost loved ones to murder. I've experienced a number of other forms of physical and other kinds of violence. And I started paying attention to the experience of the survivors around me. And not only did fewer of us want prison than that public narrative purported, but even people who got it weren't healed by it. They weren't made safe by it. They weren't made whole by it. They didn't stop living in a neighborhood where violence was common. It didn't resolve their poverty. It didn't resolve the structural issues. And it didn't even resolve like their own psychological pain. And I've come to understand that that's just not actually how we're built as people. And I don't mean that as a moral position or a political position. I mean it as a physiological observation that our bodies don't heal because other bodies experience pain. Like when you go to the doctor with a backache, they don't bring someone in from the waiting room and like whack that person in the back and then suddenly you feel like you can move okay. Like it's just not how we're made. And so that became clear to me too. So it became clear that all of the reasons we said we were doing prison weren't honest, and made me curious about what the reasons therefore might be, like where the beneficiaries were if they weren't in the mostly Black and brown communities I was living in, even as a young white person. And then at the same time that was happening, I was getting in a lot of trouble. Like I was an adolescent, so I was an idiot. And so I was doing foolish things. I was also processing a lot of trauma without like adequate resources, support, skill, maturity, time to process that. And as that happened, and as I sort of faced the most serious consequence I might face, I walked out of there with 6 months of community service. And my co-defendant left with 6 years of hard time. And I understood which snowballed into even further and worse consequences for him. And, we were in front of the same judge. We were facing the same charges. We both had court-appointed lawyers. And I understood that the difference was that he was a young Black man and I was a young white woman. I was white then too. And so what it taught me was the thing it taught me immediately was that this inequity was ferocious and wrong and was destroying people I loved, even as it expressed mercy to me. And that I had to find whomever was fighting that inequity and join with them and fight until we won or I died, whichever came first. And so I started to find ways to do that as best I could then. But it also taught me something that I wouldn't know what to do with until much later, which is it taught me that the system can do mercy when it chooses to. Prosecutors could end mass incarceration tomorrow if they wanted to without a single legislator changing a single law. Like in the juvenile system, judges could do that without a single law changing. It's not as though he and I were subject to different statutes. And so it revealed something to me about how much discretion is exercised. And in that lesson, there's a lesson both about the shame of people who continually exercise that discretion in a way that inflicts both extreme and disproportionate harm on people of color, and also a lesson about all the various ways that change is possible at a much faster pace than would otherwise be available to us, like were it not for that truth.
I really appreciate you sharing that experience, because I do think a lot of our commitment to seeing the world be different is out of lived experience. And, for me, having watched many of my family members push through the school to prison pipeline or come into contact with other areas of the criminal punishment system is why I got involved in working with young folks in the first place. And I remember very vividly, I was a chaplain at the King County Youth Detention Center here, and I was sitting with a young person who was about the age of 17. They had been in and out of the juvenile system since the age of 12. Both of their parents were incarcerated, and so they were in kinship care. And I remember this young person saying to me, Nikkita, I don't think I know how to live outside of this facility. And I just had this moment of being like, this is a child who is telling me they don't know how to live outside of an incarcerated space. And that felt like we had done something wrong, that the way in which we were choosing to engage this young person could not have been the right path if that is what they're feeling at the age of 17. And so that for me was really an awakening moment of asking the question of what can we do differently? And what are we really trying to achieve? And does this young person feeling like they cannot live outside of a jail make me safer? Does it make them safer? And the answer I came to was no. And so that really got me to digging very quickly for what are our other options. I think one thing that's really beautiful is you've been a part of developing other options. How did you arrive at some of the models, like your current work with Common Justice? What has it inspired this work? And also, can you talk about how, maybe it's not perfect off top? I mean, obviously the system we're in now is not perfect, but also we're probably not going to get it perfect as we try to move into the next thing either.
So I think what you say is such an important point. And in many ways, I feel like the most transformative question we could ask when we're looking at alternatives to incarceration, options other than policing, like new ways of addressing harm, like a question that would sort of break open and shift like our view of what we could commit to, what's possible, what's palatable, is compared to what? Like, it's just, we compare these new options as though we are comparing them to perfection. And incarceration could not be further from that. And so I think, I draw deeply on the wisdom of people like Drs. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Dr. Angela Davis, who teach us that the labor of abolition is mostly the labor of building, not of tearing down. I have a 2-year-old child now, which means I have become someone who has to know the difference between different kinds of trucks and things. This is not an area of expertise that has been required of me until now. Like, I've always lived in places with a subway, except Atlanta, but we shouldn't even go down that road. So I started paying attention at construction sites, because I used to be like, truck. And then he's like asking about the different ones. And I'm like, I'm not giving a fully honest answer. And each of these construction sites does have a bulldozer. That's my general observation. And each of them has one bulldozer. And then they have a ton of other stuff. They have this kind of crane and this other crane and one with a little thing that people can sit in. And they have things that are for electrical things and for the plumbing. And they have all sorts of things not even visible to us. And I think that is the right ratio of our work, that there are things that are about bulldozing. There are things that will have to be removed because they are in the way of what we are building. But just like most of gardening isn't weeding, like you have to weed the garden, but you mostly are planting, you're watering, you're nourishing, you're harvesting. And most of building is building, not tearing down. And so, I came to design Common Justice from a couple things. Like, one was an understanding that we wouldn't end mass incarceration unless we tackled the question of violence. That's partly because more than half of people locked up in the US are locked up for crimes of violence. But it's also this cultural thing where the reasons we choose prisons over schools and prisons over roads and prisons over, for example, a public health infrastructure that could distribute a vaccine quickly and effectively, to pick a random one, is because we're told a story of the people locked up there that are so dangerous to us that we have to be protected from them at any cost, no matter what that is. And that story is as old as this country. It is as racist as this country. And unless we come for that story at its roots, unless we say something directly into it and fight it, then I think we end up just sort of trimming the edges of the tree while we inadvertently water the roots. And so I think we have to steer into the question of violence. But then I think, unlike when you're talking about other kinds of harm, where you really can just say, like, just leave people alone. Like, the things they're doing aren't hurting anyone except arguably themselves. And if they're hurting themselves, they're deserving of care, but not punishment. When we talk about violence, we have to be able to talk about what people can do instead. Like, you can't just say, don't call 911 without saying call X. You can't just say, don't do prison without saying do X. I think that's politically true, but I also, as a survivor and as a survivor-centered person, for me, it's morally true. Like, we have to be able to offer what can take its place. And so we built Common Justice as one of a whole constellation of things that will serve the purpose of helping to displace prisons, that will do the things that prisons claim to do, like provide accountability, provide healing, keep us safe, enforce justice, and we'll do them effectively in a way prison never can and never will. And so we operate as part of our work the first and only alternative to incarceration for serious and violent felonies in the adult courts in America. It's based in restorative justice principles with the consent of the DA and of the survivor in the case. People come into, people who've done things like stabbed people, shot at people, committed gunpoint robberies, go through an intensive preparatory process, an intensive violence intervention curriculum. And they sit with the people they've harmed partway through the program and reach agreements about how they can make things as right as possible. If they fulfill those agreements and fulfill the violence intervention part of our program, the felony charges against them are dismissed. They don't serve any time. And in the meantime, we work with the people they hurt to help them come through what happened to them and in their lives generally. We are far more effective than prison. That is a very small brag. And so when I talk about compared to what, it's really important to remember that the solution we have relied on thus far for safety fails completely to deliver it. And so while I started this by saying we built it in a way that was about ending mass incarceration, what is equally true is that at the end of the day, like, I'm a violence abolitionist. Like, I want to live in a world without violence. Having survived it, having witnessed it, having lost people to it, having held people through the pain of it, I'm done. I want to live in a society without violence. And if that's what I want to do, then what I do is I look in my society for everything that produces violence and I try and eradicate it, right? That's what you do if you don't want something. Like if there's a nasty smell in your house, you look for the source of the smell and you take that thing out, right? And in examining my society for the things that produce violence, they are structural things. They are things like inequity and poverty and a lack of social service infrastructure. And one of the single greatest, most substantial, most egregious contributors to violence is prison. And so I don't actually have to hate prison to want to get rid of prison. I have to hate violence to want to get rid of prison. And as someone in the business of ending violence, like, we know the core drivers of violence are structural. They're those things I named, like poverty and inequity, bad school, like lack of solid schooling, healthcare, mental health care. But on an individual level, the core drivers of violence are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and inability to meet one's economic needs. And the core features of prison are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. And so we are responding to violence with exactly the things that generate it. I've said it's like showing up at a house fire with a hose full of gasoline. And like, as a resident of that house, which I believe all of us are, I want a hose full of water, right? Like, I want to survive. I want others to survive. And so for me, the project of figuring out what we do instead of prison doesn't actually require that I form any opinion about prison whatsoever, other than the practical observation that it fails to keep me and others safe.
Yeah, thank you for that's such a holistic answer. I was like, how does she remember all of those things? One of the quotes from the book that stuck with me was, perhaps one of the greatest harms the criminal justice system has done is persuaded us that we do not know how to solve the problems that arise between and amongst us. We've been taught that our experience is inconsequential in comparison to the evidence the experts present, and that the strategies we gravitate towards instinctively, such as calling each other's families first instead of the police, addressing the underlying causes of people's behavior, requiring people to get back to those they harmed, are somehow not only wrong, but socially irresponsible. I feel like we hear this a lot, even if it's subconsciously, that the solutions we come up with in community are not enough, or that somehow we're willing to abandon our communities to violence. But I feel like, you know, as you were just saying, like, those of us that want to move beyond prisons and police as our means of responding to harm are actually interested in stopping harm before it occurs, finding ways to intervene when it's happening. And when it does happen, because we are human beings, actually finding real ways to heal harm. I think a lot of folks, whether it's the person who has survived harm or the person who caused the harm, when finding oneself in the criminal punishment system, actually see that harm be further exacerbated by the way in which the criminal punishment system works. And so really asking the question of, like, what brings healing, whether that's talking about systemic harm or harm that happens between individuals, how do we heal that harm? And so, you know, what are some of the values and the ways in which Common Justice does this, or that you've done this in other work, to actually see people brought to a place of restoration rather than the isolation that prisons like remove people from communities and then put them in a place of violence, rather than finding ways of keeping people in community and restoring and addressing harm.
So one thing that was really helpful in like the development of me figuring out what on earth to do with myself was falling in love with accountability. Just like I'm madly in love with accountability, and I just fall more and more. It's like one of those stories where they're like, my grandparents have been together for 100 years and every day they're more in love. Like I'm more in love with accountability every day. And I think we talk about accountability and punishment like they're the same thing, like they're used synonymously. And you see this all the time, even as recently as people's reactions to the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial, where people are like, finally, there's some accountability. And I want to really resist the conflation of those two things. Because what I've come to understand is not only are they not the same, I think that they are antithetical. Punishment is passive. Punishment is something someone does to me. All I have to do to be punished is to not escape it. Accountability is active. It requires I acknowledge what I've done. I acknowledge its impact. I express genuine remorse. I make things as right as possible, ideally in a way defined by those harmed. And I become someone who will not cause that harm ever again. So for the person who caused harm, accountability is deeply rooted in their human dignity. So instead of saying you used your life force, you used your human power to cause harm. And so what we are going to try and do is to diminish that life force and diminish that power, to cage it somewhere, to shrink it, to beat it out of you, to degrade it out of you. Instead, what we say is we are going to require that you use that force in an equal and opposite way for repair. Like that's, you are obligated to something. Like I've said, if it's like the criminal justice system, if someone burned down your house, all the criminal justice system can do for you is burn down their house in your name. I want somewhere to live. Right. And so what restorative justice and transformative justice say is like, if you burn down someone's house, you are indebted to build them a home, right? Like that you are indebted to contribute to their healing, to their repair, to the broader thing. And in doing that, it is much harder work than prison. Like virtually every participant in common justice at some point is like, I should have just done the bid. And we're like, I mean, if you were looking for easier, probably correct. More dignified, more useful, like anything else, you'll choose this. None of them actually tend to hold that view for more than the couple days they're annoyed with us. But it happens because it's hard. Like the labor of accountability is hard. And all of us have had to apologize. Like think about the third time you're late to someone you respect and you consider being like the subway, maybe where you are, you say traffic. Like you consider lying to someone you know and love because you're so ashamed that you're behind, just like left the house late because you couldn't decide what sweater to wear because you didn't know if it was gonna be warm or cold later. Like, and you're in a relationship with someone you love and you think about lying to them because it's so hard to say, like, I actually just made a mistake and I'm sorry. Like scale that up to having hurt someone terribly, right? Accountability is extraordinarily demanding. And we talk about accountability as not just saying sorry, but doing sorry. Right? Not feeling sorry, being sorry, doing sorry. Like, what does it look like as a set of actions? And so that is something that is like deeply rooted in the dignity of people who have caused harm. But it also has in it these things survivors need. So if you ask survivors what they want answers. They want to know, like, why me? Was it a real gun? Did you think I said something? Did you think I was affiliated? What was that about? They want to express how it felt. Like, how dare you? Do you know how it affected my family? This is how it felt to me, to my children who had to see me come home like that, all of it. And they want a sense of control relative to the outcome. Because at the end of the day, trauma distills down to powerlessness, which means the opposite of trauma isn't help. The opposite of trauma is power. And so people want power. And all those things survivors want, things we just naturally long for, are actually entirely supported in the psychological literature as precisely the things that support the cessation of the symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. And so they're right to want it in every sense, right? And they don't get that when someone's incarcerated. They don't get to ask why. They don't get to express anything. They don't get to shape the outcome. They don't get any degree of power relative to what happened. And so in the process that demands something of the person who caused harm, is in it the things that contribute to the people who were healed. And we have a story that the only thing someone causes harm, the only thing someone who causes harm can do ever again is cause more harm. It's wrong. One of the things people who cause harm can do is to repair. And the thing that survivors are most entitled to, the things they need most, that are most useful to them, are those forms of repair. And so one of my favorite things about the work we do, like one of the greatest gifts, is that we don't have to choose. When I was little, I got in trouble at school because there was a test and it was multiple choice. And on 4 or 5 of the questions, I added in a question that was like both of the above or all of the above and selected it. And the teacher was like, this sassy nonsense shall not live in my class. But I was right. And I was like, the test was wrong. I was like, I couldn't answer A because in choosing A, it meant B was wrong. And here's how B is also true. I understand that A is true, but you didn't seem to understand how B is also true. And I think that's just, I think that the gift we have is to get to say, like, both of these things are true. People who are hurt are owed something. People who cause harm owe something to them. And we can hold both of them in their human dignity at the same time, and neither has to cancel the other out.
Yeah, you say in your book, first of all, I just want to tell everyone you should read Danielle's book, especially if you're looking for more stories about how the work of common justice happens and the impact of that work. The book really does outline that. And I want to let those of you all watching know that you can submit questions and hop in this conversation. So feel free to do that throughout the dialogue. And there will be 15 minutes at the end for you to hear more from Danielle to answer your questions. But a quote in the book is, "Survivors therefore need something from those of us committed to them. If it is true that survivors are a far wider ranging group of people than we know, it is true that incarceration does not consistently deliver safety and almost never delivers healing. If it is true that basic things like validation, control, and a coherent narrative are necessary elements for coming through trauma, if it is true that survivors who are given options almost always choose anything other than prison, if it is true that millions of survivors tell us again and again every time they do not call the police that what the criminal justice system has to offer does not work for them, then it does seem to follow that survivors absolutely, urgently need all of us to end mass incarceration. It may be the only practical thing we can do in their names." And just, one of the things I feel like I really learned from reading your material, watching your work, is what it looks like to have survivor-centered solutions, and that is actually much more nuanced than kind of the you're either a survivor or a harm doer that the criminal punishment system offers us. How is it that common justice finds ways to build, and it sounds like it's case by case, that y'all do a lot of prep work and a lot of intimate building with all of the parties. What does that look like?
I think I'll start at the beginning, which is, I said at the top that we only take cases if the survivors agree. And that's not a small thing. So fewer than half of survivors of violence call the police in the first place. That's actually a wild number for us to consider, that half of people have decided they prefer nothing from that system than everything it has to offer. Another half of those will drop off before grand jury. So 75% of survivors have already voted, like with their hands, with their bodies, with their lives, in saying that what's available in the criminal justice system is not what they need. That remaining subset is arguably the jailingest subset of survivors, right? They're the people who are pursuing a process they know is likely to result in the incarceration of the person who hurt them. And those are the people we call and say, do you want that person in common justice, or do you want them in prison? People who have had guns to their head, lacerations to their liver, serious injuries, and 90% choose common justice. And when we first saw that number, I thought like people were better than I knew, that we were merciful and compassionate, and thought, but for the grace of God, go I. And that was true sometimes, but not most of the time. And what was really happening is something I should have known as a survivor myself. And the best way I've been able to describe it is that as survivors, we will feel pain so deep we wouldn't like wring out our bones to be free of it, like from the marrow there. And we feel fear so intrusive that in our own homes, in the arms of the people we trust most, we are unable to sleep. And when exhaustion finally takes us, we wake from that sleep with nightmares, and we will feel rage so all-consuming it makes us unrecognizable even to ourselves. And at the end of the day, we are pragmatic. Like, there are two things we can't stand. We can't stand the idea of going through it again, and we can't stand the idea of someone else going through it. And so if you present us with a choice, no matter our fear, no matter our loss, no matter our rage, we will choose the thing we think will prevent the thing that we can't stand. And there are no people who it's harder to persuade that incarceration will work than people who live in neighborhoods where incarceration is common. Like, they have paid the price of prison's failure to produce safety with their enduring pain. Like, if incarceration worked to produce safety, the United States would be the safest country in all of human history. Like, East New York, Brooklyn, like where's the highest concentration of incarceration in New York, would be like the Garden of Eden. Like, there would have to be memorials when a kitty got accidentally run over by a truck, given the sheer rates of enforcement that we've imposed. Like, it doesn't work. And people know that. Not because they read all the studies about how prison is in fact criminogenic, some have read those, but because they have watched people go away and come back. They have lived in a neighborhood where this is the primary safety strategy, and it has not kept them safe. And the evidence is in their bodies. And so when they choose something else, it's not because like they read that really compelling op-ed by Michelle Alexander in the Times, right? It's like, I think about it like, if you have migraines that go on for years and your doctor says to you, there's this new experimental medication and it's still relatively new, it's showing really promising effects and virtually no side effects. And are you interested in trying? You say yes, not because you've always wanted to be part of a clinical trial. Like, you say yes because the pain of the status quo is unsustainable, it's unendurable, and you want relief from that pain. And so I think the thing we do that is so powerful at Common Justice is that we offer people an option. And then once they choose that option, they continue to shape it from that first day all the way through. Do they want to come to the circle or have someone else there? What agreements do they want to see? What do they want people to do to make it right? What help do they want for themselves that has nothing to do with the person who hurt them? They could choose to have wraparound services from us and never sit down in that circle with that person if they didn't want to. So they get to continually explore what their healing might be. And in the meantime, to your point, Nikkita, that like, these are not two groups of people. Part of why we say harmed party and responsible party is it describes your relationship to an event, not your whole identity. And because you're the responsible party in that event, you have an obligation to that person. And you are almost certainly someone who is the harmed party in any number of other events. And you are owed something in those. Like, you are owed repair. You are owed your healing for the things that were done to you. And so a lot of our work with our responsible parties is, again, that both and of giving what they owe to the people they hurt and also accessing what they deserve as people who have been hurt, who have almost never before then received the repair they deserve. And I know like the work that you are building and doing in Seattle is really visionary in this respect. It's like really powerful and grounded, and it's complicated in the way the best of this work is always complicated. And I wonder if you would take a minute, at least, like to tell us some about like what you see where you are, like what's working, like what's beautiful.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. What I find most beautiful about the work that's happening in Seattle King County is that impacted communities have really found ways to lead the way. So in 2012, King County had a levy that voters voted on for a new Children and Family Justice Center. And young people and impacted folks saw that this was actually a new set of juvenile courts and a jail. And that built upon other work with like the Black Prisoners Caucus or the Village of Hope that had been happening for many years before. And young folks and communities really started to organize what we call now the No New Youth Jail movement. And it brought a lot of attention to the conversation, not just of mass incarceration, but like, what are we doing to provide safety in communities? And how are communities that have experienced a huge amount of systemic violence, impacted by the school to prison pipeline, and how do we dismantle that pipeline, and then how do we build opportunities for healing, but also acknowledge that healing is much deeper than the harm that happened presently. There are historical harms and systemic harms that continue to happen. And so that conversation at first was very challenging, but now in 2021, we're seeing our county move towards not just zero youth detention, but in July of 2020, the county executive announced a plan to close the youth jail and repurpose it. And I know that could not have happened but for community organizing for a very long time to draw attention to the conversation of what really keeps us safe, what really brings healing. How do we keep young people out of the school to prison pipeline? And so that's where organizations like the one that I partner with, Creative Justice, which is an arts-based, healing engaged space for young people who are impacted by oppressive systems. And we started out at first a diversion program and realized very quickly that diversion is still, in a lot of ways, the arm of the criminal punishment system, that young people still have to be sucked into the school to prison pipeline or find themselves strapped with criminal cases and often the collateral consequences of that to access a diversion program. And so over time, we've been able to evolve into building healing engaged spaces that do the work of prevention and intervention. And that's not work that we do alone. It really is a network of community-based organizations like Community Passageways and Choose 180 and Collective Justice, each of which take a slightly different angle on how do we do this work. Collective Justice is very much like Common Justice, doing work that partners with those who have been harmed to provide other ways of seeing that harm addressed with the responsible party. Whereas Community Passageways is an anti-violence, violence intervention program that literally gets in relationship with the young people that are most likely to find themselves gang involved or in violent situations. And I think what's most powerful about our region is we're developing a network and a coalition of organizations that take on different aspects of how do you prevent violence, how do you heal harm, acknowledging that we need a menu of options. And part of the struggle right now is for folks is 911 is the only option most people know, and it is the most well-funded option. And so when someone is in crisis, often the only thing that you can receive is an armed police officer who may contribute more to the harm that has already happened. And you may see more and more people criminalized in the process of trying to provide support. And so, our goal as community orgs is to continue doing this work of asking questions about, is our public health and public safety system working? And we've seen the answer to that as no, and the George Floyd uprisings in 2020 continued that conversation. And then redistributing resources to those things we know can work. And I think even more is like doing that deep work, that culture shifting work in community, because we all have ingested this punitive system. Like, we are fish in water. And as a result, I think teaching restorative and transformative justice as not just models for how we address harm and like the big picture of our communities, but also interpersonally requires doing that deep work, because we've been taught to act punitively with each other. I see it when with even like my sister's children, and how sometimes we might interact when I don't get the behavior that I want. That's essentially what the criminal punishment system is. It's a punitive response that says, I'm not getting the behavior that I want, so I'm going to punish you. And so how do we do that in our families? How do we do that in our relationships with our loved ones and our partners? How do we do that with our friends? And I do think that cultural work will allow us to shift like the bigger systems that we're wanting to see behave differently, because we will even have a different way of modeling what does it look like to address harm and behavior, even within our families.
I think it's so beautiful, and it sort of circles me back in some ways to your first question. So makes me think of this story where my godson, I spent a lot of time with him. He's white too, this godson is. And when he would do things as a kid, we would like, do the restorative justice steps, right? So he would have to like acknowledge what he did. He'd have to acknowledge how it felt. He'd have to say he was sorry. He'd have to ask how he could make it right and do that. And then he'd have to like say he wasn't going to do it again. And so it'd be things like he'd throw a Cheerio. I'd ask him not to. He'd throw another one at my head. I'd be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. What happened? He'd be like, I threw a Cheerio at your head. It made you feel sad because you asked me not to and I did it anyway. I'm sorry. What can I do? I'd be like, you can kiss my forehead. He'd kiss it and he'd say, I'm sorry, I'll try not to do it again. And we'd be done. It's like 15 seconds, right? We read this book together a few years later called Moses. I'm actually looking, I feel like I could have it like a little like, it's about Harriet Tubman. And in the course of reading it, I had to talk to him about what slavery was. And like, don't make me your child's godparent if you don't want me to talk about slavery. And I described it as something white people did to Black people. And he said, well, did we ask how it felt? And I was like, well, some of us did, but he was like, well, but we did it together. And I was like, yeah. He's like, did we ask together? I said, well, no. And he was like, so we didn't say we heard how it felt. And I was like, well, no. And he's like, well, did we say we're sorry? And I was like, well, some people, he's like, did we say we're sorry together? And I was like, no, we haven't. And he's like, well, do we ask what we could do to fix it? And I said, no. And he's looking at me like, and I got to do this over a Cheerio? Like the hypocrisy was really intense. Did we ask? No, we haven't asked what we could do. He's like, so we didn't do anything to fix it. And I was like, well, no. And he's like, so at least do we not do it anymore? And he was aware of my work at Common Justice. And I was like, well, what we do in prisons is actually in many ways really similar. And he's like, well, I think we need to say we're sorry and ask how we can fix it. And we need to do it really, really fast because we're really, really late. And he's not wrong, right? And it's like, so he arrives at the conclusion that like reparations are required of us, which I think is actually just an entirely logical conclusion. And he actually is extremely brilliant, but it wasn't his brilliance that led to it. It's that he applied the same structure, like he applied the Cheerio structure, right? They're like, what do we do when we cause harm? And it's really like those steps I talked about earlier for interpersonal harm. Like, I think that's what's required of us as a country. Like we have put people in cages, like ripped them from their families and the people who love them, who have struggled with loss and pain in their absence. And like in those cages, we have caused them extraordinary harm. And we continue to do that knowing what happens there and knowing that it doesn't even produce the benefit we claimed it would. So we can't even pretend it's a terrible thing for some necessary good. And we have known that. And like all of us are in the category of people who knew or people who should have known. Like there is no other category. And we owe something for that pain. Like we did that in the name of survivors who we told them it would heal, knowing that it wouldn't, in the presence of no evidence ever that it would heal them. And we told them that anyway, and then watched them live with continuous pain and then used that pain to justify things like denying parole and keeping someone in a cage, even though that pain should have taught us that none of what we were doing was healing them. Like we've done this for so long and we owe something. And I do think the steps are the same. I think we acknowledge what we've done and we acknowledge its impact and we express genuine remorse and we make things as right as possible, ideally in a way defined by those harmed. And we become a people who will never do that ever again. And I think you're right. I think it starts by practicing in relationship. I think as white folks, like the modes of exile and punishment, of control, of throwing people away, like we build them into our institutions, but we practice them every day in our homes and in our relationships. It's why we get mad and we think the thing we should do is unfriend someone on Facebook. In all of the relationships I have with Black people to whom I am accountable, I have been asked to do many things. I have never once been asked to unfriend someone on Facebook. Like that is not the demand on us. Like if anything, I have been asked to be in closer relationship, to be like, if you can't get to them, who can? Like go get your cousins, literally and figuratively. Like you don't get to throw people away. You have to go be there until, because if you don't, who will and who will pay the price? And so I think there is a demand on us as white folks, and I think you have to be part of making right. And I think we figure out how to do that as many scales as possible, right? How do we support national and local efforts at reparations? Like, how do we support and lift up the leadership and resourcing of organizations led by people of color and Black people in particular? How do we talk to our aunts, our cousins, our mothers, our children? Like, how do we show up in relationship in a way that starts to uproot the habits of white supremacy? And it means, I think often as white folks, when we first start on our anti-racist journeys, we're like, okay, I understand that I am not better than Black people. Question, who am I better than? Because we're so trained in hierarchy and superiority. We're like, we want to put people in categories and then rank the categories and then rank within the categories. Like, it's our favorite thing. It's very hard for us not to do. And so we're like, I know who I'm better than, other racist white people. Right. And we start to play this thing out with one another where we're just sort of competing in a way that is not actually about transformation. It's not actually rooted in our relationship and accountability to Black and brown people. It is still a matter of competition and ranking and punishment and throwing away and all of those things with one another. And so I think the real challenge to us is to figure out a way to love people of color and to love other white people simultaneously, like to really do that. And the world as we know it is not structured as to make that way of living readily available to any of us. Like, it's an extraordinary ask. And it's one that, like, if it becomes like one of the most important things to us to be able to do, like, it will push us to be part of like some of the most radical change to take part in our lifetimes. And not because we're abolitionists and not because we're wild in the streets or we're activists or we're anti this or anti that, but because we're like, actually, what happens if I need to be able to love other white people and people of color at the same time and like really do that? And like I mentioned before, I have a 2-year-old now. Like, I do not want him to live in a world where that is structurally impossible. Right. And I don't want to, I have the luck of the fortune, the privilege enforced by power everywhere, that I can usually trust that if he leaves my home, he will come back to it. And that if God forbid he doesn't, it won't because of something a police officer did. But I also do not want to explain to this child why someone stood with his knee on another person's neck and let him die in front of everybody. Like, that's not the world I want for him. And so I think if we are really serious of the fortune about privilege, like, I mean, I think people like love sounds really soft. Like, it's all about love. They're like, oh, she's soft on everything. I don't think there's a harder or more substantial demand than love. I don't think there is a harder thing to do. I don't think there is a thing that requires more courage, more strength, more consistency, more honesty, more risk than love. And so when I talk about love, I'm like, that's some hardcore shit to commit to. But were we to commit to it, I think those other commitments would have to follow.
Yeah, because I think love requires relationship and accountability. And, you know, living in the Pacific Northwest where we're quote unquote so progressive and everyone's so woke, I think people miss those two pieces, actually. That just because you intellectually know the right words or you have the philosophy or you've read 1,000 books on the topic and you can regurgitate what was in those books doesn't mean that you have figured out how to be in relationship, an accountable relationship with each other. And I do think that that is foundational to us being able to build a world beyond police and prisons, because when we think about the myriad of community collaborations needed to provide a menu of options for safety, that will take accountable relationships. And so, you know, just thinking a lot about how do we shift the way in which we build relationships. You know, we live in a city where there are lots of people without homes. There are regular sweeps of folks without homes. There's a lot of gentrification and displacement. And the way in which, you know, corporations function and development has happened has actually increased that displacement and gentrification and decreased our ability to build those healthy community connections that build safer communities. And so, one of the things I think a lot about is like, what are people's basic needs? Because we know that when we actually commit the energy and the resources to seeing people's basic needs met, which includes healthy relationship, we actually see the likelihood of violence begin to substantially decrease because we've created the social and economic safety net. That means people don't have to resort to hard choices between rent and food and maybe doing some things that are considered illegal or unhealthy. I think there's also just the way in which we've chosen to engage with certain types of behaviors, like criminalizing drug use is really antithetical to actually seeing folks who use drugs get to function in a healthy way. And so how are we approaching each other from a place of health and care? And so also just thinking about, as a city, what are we doing to build healthier communities, and thinking about what promotes that. In the work that you've been doing, how do you convince, I have to talk to prosecutors on a regular basis, and it's usually as the mitigation specialist or with a mitigation specialist. And so how have you been able to convince the system that gets to make choices about what is public health and public safety, that this is the direction we should go?
So when I say I believe everyone can transform, right, that includes people who have committed attempted murder. It includes people who have committed serious violence, and it includes prosecutors. It includes everybody. I find the sort of new, hungry prosecutors are the hardest to work with, who sort of come out the gate of law school excited about locking people up and very persuaded of their excellence because they were just at whatever rank in their class. They can be difficult to engage. The prosecutors I find easiest to engage are people who've been doing it for a long time. And the ones you would sort of think would be hardest, who are sort of fixed in their ways, been in the office forever, like this is their life's work. And I think they signed up for this work because they signed up for civil service, right? They signed up with an idea that they would be contributing to justice, contributing to safety, helping victims. And in the course of their careers, it becomes evident to them that the tools available to them are not doing that to the degree that they thought they would. And some prosecutors deal with that by like aggressively trying to shut out like all of the information that runs contrary to their kind of the belief system that supports their day-to-day. And others start to really grapple with that limit in a way that's very painful. Like I think about Eric Gonzalez, RDA in Brooklyn. And I remember when he said to me, and this was before he was campaigning, so it wasn't even like a catchy campaign thing. We said, like, I remember the first time I looked at a 50-page rap sheet and understood it as a story of our failure instead of a story of his. He's like, we had that person 50 times and nothing we did changed anything in the course of his life. And he's like, we won't let you have somebody twice, like, and so for him to see that, and I think at our best, what we do with prosecutors is we ask them what they want to see come of their work. And if what they want is for victims to be okay and for communities to be safe and for justice to be served, then they'll understand in watching us and observing the outcomes we produce that having another option is in the interest of them doing the thing that they want to do, like in the thing that makes meaning of their one precious life. And so when I think about which prosecutors will do common justice, it's not like, are they progressive or not? Are they red or blue? I don't think that's actually the thing. I think it's like, is their bottom line safety or punishment? If their bottom line is punishment, we're a bad fit. And if their bottom line is safety, they can get more safety from us. Like it's painful for prosecutors to whoever re-encounter a victim 20 years later where they worked on the case and found that person is in equal or more pain than when they last saw them. Like confronting the limitations of their strategy in actually helping people is painful. And I think people are most likely to be willing to do that confrontation if they also have something available they can do instead. Because then as they see it, they can also move to something else instead of having to just see it and sit with it forever. The other thing I would say about prosecutors, though, is that prosecutors are elected, and that's very relevant. So in Brooklyn, Ken Thompson succeeded Joe Hines. Joe Hines had a reputation as the most progressive prosecutor in America, that once in a while George Gascon would, West Coast, East Coast battle it out, but nobody anywhere in between. And when Ken Thompson defeated Joe, Ken was a Black man who grew up in Brooklyn in project housing some of the time, made his way up into like being a federal prosecutor, all of this. And Ken Thompson was much more committed to bringing common justice to scale than Joe had been, though Joe is the reason we started, to his real true credit. And Ken did not bring common justice to scale because he understood structural racism more, though he arguably did, clearly did. He didn't bring it to scale more because he liked diversion more. I'm not sure that he did. He didn't bring it more to scale because he was less risk averse. If anything, he was fairly risk averse and very methodical in his thinking. The difference was that Ken won that election by campaigning primarily in Black and brown neighborhoods in Brooklyn. So his constituents were the people who would be impacted by the choices he made. Tons of people came out to vote for him who had not voted in recent elections. And in making himself structurally accountable to the people whose lives depended on the choices he made, it meant that his risk calculus became aligned with theirs. And the people of Black and brown central Brooklyn aren't taking him out of office because he gives someone a program and that person commits a new crime. Like, they know 5 people in their neighborhood who everybody knows killed somebody, never were arrested. They know 50 people who came home from prison worse for it. Like, they are not removing someone from office for one like Willie Horton moment, right? And so when Ken became bolder, it's because he knew who he was answerable to. And so I think the biggest predictor of a prosecutor's behavior is not actually their own lived experience, is not the goodness of their heart, is not even their policy platform. It's who their constituents are. Like, we all know who can fire us. And prosecutors whose voter base, the people they depend on to keep their jobs, are the people who are impacted by their choices, will, in my view, always make better choices. And I know it's sort of a weird time in the United States to be like pro-representative democracy. I know that's like an outlier view right now, but I still like it. Like, I still think that people being accountable to the people who are impacted by their choices is a really cool way to structure a government. And I think when we see that among these prosecutors, we actually see shifts that we don't see even with people with progressive platforms who don't have that same kind of accountability.
I really appreciate you bringing nuance to the conversation. I personally find it very hard to talk about prosecution in any type of way that lends it any credit, just because my experience with prosecutors has been so negative. And I think the one thing I appreciate about the myriad of folks that are doing work to get us beyond prisons and police, who do believe in abolition, but work from different angles, is always the opportunity to have the discussion in a wider, deeper way and think about the different levers we can be pulling to actually get us to that space. Because I think in a world where you can drop a post on Facebook or write something on Twitter, the requirement to have nuance is a lot less. You don't have to think nuance because you get immediate feedback from people in your algorithm about what you think, right? And so I appreciate you speaking on that point because I tend to often be the person who's like, I'm not talking to the prosecutors if I don't have to, but do appreciate that in the system we're in now, we have to do the work of mitigating the harm that is being caused while simultaneously holding the line of the values of the world we want to build in that space. And so I appreciate you for just sharing so thoughtfully and speaking from the heart, and want to encourage everyone who watched this to read your book, to get a little more depth and nuance about what common justice is and how common justice does their work, and want to invite Town Hall Seattle back because I know they're going to close us out. So thanks for this conversation opportunity to build with you, Danielle.
Thank you so much, Nikkita.
And I just want to say on behalf of Town Hall Seattle, thank you so much, Danielle and Nikkita. That was an amazing conversation. Really appreciate you both taking your Sunday afternoon with us to talk about this important topic. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. And just another pitch to purchase a copy of Until We Reckon from our partner bookseller, Elliott Bay Book Company. And I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.